Hello, and welcome to today's Healthcare Purchasing News webcast. Our topic is in-house versus centralized instrument processing, ensuring the quality of your process, sponsored by Midmark. I'm Jeanette Wider, Editor-in-Chief of Healthcare Purchasing News, and I will be moderating this session. Before we dive into today's presentation, let me explain how you can engage with us during the webinar. If you encounter any technical issues, please type your concern into the Ask a Question box, and a member of our team will assist you. We also encourage you to submit your questions throughout the event. We will address as many as possible during the Q&A session after the main presentation, but feel free to send in questions at any time. To refer a colleague to today's webcast, share it on social media, or access event resources, click on the icons on the left side rail of your screen. Lastly, please note that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Healthcare Purchasing News website within the next week. You will receive an email notification once the recording is live. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Ben Hill is Marketing Manager in the Medical Division at Midmark Corporation. In his position, Ben supports the Midmark commitment to supply healthcare providers with solutions that enable the most effective and efficient patient care through seamless room design, better equipment, smarter workflows, and integrated technologies. He is responsible for driving the product marketing strategies, product launches, and programs supporting the instrument processing product category. We are thrilled to have you here with us today, and I know our audience is eager to learn the best practices for processing medical instruments to prevent infections. With that, let's jump right into it. Ben, I'm going to turn this over to you. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeanette. As was mentioned, my name is Ben Hill. Today we'll be discussing instrument processing, specifically the design that you can use to ensure quality of instrument processing, regardless of what approach you take. There are two main approaches that we will get into discussion about a little bit later in this presentation. But as was mentioned, my name is Ben Hill, and I'm a marketing manager at Midmark Corporation. And specifically, I'm focused on those instrument processing products and processes that we see in the medical space. Learning objectives for today, we're going to cover the importance of instrument processing as part of an infection prevention program. We'll discuss how the right design approach can impact the quality of instrument processing, the importance of standardizing the space itself. And then lastly, we'll discuss how equipment manufacturers can actually be a valuable resource during the design and implementation of an instrument processing environment. For some manufacturers, this even extends beyond the traditional buying cycle to incorporate post-sale training for staff. So the term IP is a commonly used acronym and can mean a lot of different things. I know before I was ever in this world, in the medical world, IP always meant intellectual property in my mind when I heard that term IP. But now I think of it as instrument processing, or I think of it as infection prevention. So those are the two types of IP that we're going to be discussing today. And when thinking about infection prevention, it's really important to include a robust instrument processing plan. There's this continually growing pressure to reduce HIs or healthcare associated infections. And instrument processing is really highly regulated. It's time consuming, it's labor intensive. And when you couple that with other challenges, it can be a contributing factor to burnout and staff shortages. And even though it can be challenging to perform instrument processing to those high standards, it's really vital to do that to reduce the likelihood of infections. So in order to alleviate some of the burden on staff, it's important to take a design approach that's holistic and focuses on ensuring quality. This will set your staff up to deliver consistent care and reduce the risk of missteps or errors. And so I mentioned at the top that there would be two different approaches we would discuss when it comes to instrument processing. The first approach is centralized, or the utilization of a central sterile processing. So this involves transporting the instruments off-site, and then the reprocessing is typically done by a third party. And then once the instruments have been sterilized, they're returned back to their original location and they're stored until their next use. The other approach would be in-house processing. So, of course, if you're going to do it in-house, then you're going to need to have a dedicated area on site to house clean and dirty instruments. You're going to need instruments being stored until their next use. But actually, the key to remember is that both strategies, the instrument processing, the actual work of instrument processing starts and ends at the point of use or the point of care. Once an instrument is utilized, it needs to be appropriately handled until it can be sterilized. And then once it's sterile again, it must remain sterile until it's being utilized again. So if you think of that cycle, starting in the point of care or starting at the point of care, it's got to get to sterilization and then back to the point of care. So it's really making sure that all the way through that process, the necessary steps are being taken, that there's a good solid workflow through each one of those areas. So how can we design for such high standards? And I think it's important to consider two questions when we're doing this. First, we should consider what patients want. And then second, we should consider what clinicians want. So patients, they're looking for a safer healthcare experience, right? They're looking for assurances that proper precautions are being taken, that their well-being is assured, right? And then aside from general facility cleanliness, I think it's just noticeable when an organization has a set of protocols in place that they're following. You can tell the difference when someone has standards and is applying them, or best practices, and it just kind of permeates the facility. And this can help patients feel at ease. And then clinicians, they want the same thing, right? They want having a safe work environment. They want clear expectations. When you have a process in place, you have clear expectations, both for yourself and for others, and how the instruments will be handled, how they will be received. Everyone is working to the same standard, and that's helpful. So I mentioned standards, regulations, best practices, and I think at this point we should stop for a second and talk a little bit about what each of those things means. There are really three categories. There's regulation, accreditation, and then there are guidelines. So let's start with regulations. We've got FDA and OSHA here on screen, and the regulations that they set are rules or laws that govern behavior. They are required. And then accreditation is something that facilities can pursue so that they can demonstrate compliance. They'll hire a third party such as the AAAHC or the Joint Commission, and those groups will come in and audit the practices of a facility. And then they can give them guidance as to any pitfalls that need to be addressed, right? Any gaps in their current processes. And then finally, there are evidence-based guidelines. These aren't laws, but they are best practices. And accrediting bodies will still hold facilities to these guidelines, again, even though they're not laws, because part of the audit process is ensuring that facilities are following best practices. So it may not be the letter of the law, but it's still something that you need to be doing in order to be accredited and in order to show that you're doing your best to take care of both your staff and patients. And those best practices come from organizations such as FGI, CDC, AAMI, and they all provide guidance that can apply to a variety of spaces. They do provide specific instrument processing guidelines, and they actually provide it in different sizes, right? So if you're doing like single room instrument processing, there's guidance for that. If you're doing multi-room, there's separate guidance for that. And then beyond those best practices and regulations, there's one more thing that you're going to be held to if an accrediting agency comes in to take a look at your processes, and that's the processes that you set for yourself. So if you write something down in your standard operating procedures, you will be held to that, even if it's not a law, a requirement, a best practice, any of those things. Once you write it down and kind of make it the law of your facility, then you will be held to that unless you change the SOPs. So thinking about all of those things, the best practices, the actual laws, following your SOPs, when you start piling this on, it can feel really daunting, especially if you are a newcomer in the space. Maybe you don't have a lot of history or experience with instrument processing, and it can just be somewhat intimidating to a new user. So it kind of makes sense that some facilities would want to consider that offsite reprocessing that I mentioned, right? They might feel like it's best to let someone else handle all these complexities. They know what they're doing. They're a third party. This is their job. It's important to remember, however, that not all responsibilities are going to fall to that third party. So again, I mentioned earlier, instrument processing starts and ends at the point of care. So you need a process in place to transport instruments from the point of care to that third party, and they need to be transported in an appropriate manner. And then you're also going to need sterile areas and aseptic transport when the items are returned to the facility so that they can be stored until their next use. And because of that, even though you're not doing the actual processing in-house, you're still going to be subject to many of the same guidelines that you would be if you did decide to do processing in-house. So what are those guidelines? Some of those include having a separate, discrete area specifically designed for instrument processing and sterilization. If you're going to do things in-house, you need to have a special space for that. Ideally, this space is centrally located. It's easily accessible. How much space you need should actually be dictated by the needs of the facility. So based on procedure volume, frequency of instrument use, you can kind of determine how many sterilizers do you need, how much storage are we going to need, things like that. Design and layout should really be taken into consideration, not only for those purposes, but also to enhance quality and have a appropriate workflow. So let's take a look at what a well-designed workflow might be. This is a space that's designed to take quality and workflow into consideration. And there are a few best practices and regulations that we can see being considered in the design of this space. So let's start on the left side of the image. On the left, there's a clear space to land dirty instruments, and then there are two receptacles at the back for waste at the back of the countertop. There's a single sink for an initial cleaning, followed by an ultrasonic cleaner for a secondary cleaning. And then there's a double basin sink following the ultrasonic cleaner so that a final rinse can be performed. To the right of that second sink, there's a physical barrier that separates dirty and clean spaces, and a dedicated wrapping or prep space is provided in between the dirty space and the sterilizers themselves. Next, you see the two sterilizers, and then all the way on the right there, denoted in the blue glass, is the storage area for sterile products. So looking at the space as a whole, you can clearly see there's a dirty to clean workflow. Like I said, the blue glass denotes clean on the right, the red on the left is dirty. So there are visual indicators throughout this image that'll show you we're working dirty to clean, we're moving left to right. And then you can see that those 5 steps are being followed: that receiving, cleaning, prep and package, sterilization, monitoring, and then storage. And because these 5 steps are a critical element of the design, I kind of want to break each one of them down a little bit more in depth. So let's start with that first section, that step 1, receiving and cleaning. So reusable instruments, supplies, and equipment need to be received and cleaned in this first section. Prior to handling anything contaminated, staff should ensure that they're wearing the appropriate PPE. They can begin sorting and performing an initial cleaning using both manual methods and ultrasonics, right? I mentioned that first sync and then the ultrasonic following it. Ultrasonics are really helpful because they can reduce the amount of time spent manually cleaning instruments, and they can help get into hinges or joints that might be more challenging to clean by hand. And then once they get through the ultrasonic cleaner, instruments can be given a final rinse in that double basin sink. One thing I want to mention here regarding the PPE, if this is a shared space, I mentioned this should not be a shared space if possible. If this were a shared space, you have to consider that other users in the space might not be wearing PPE. So I've seen sometimes instrument processing rooms combined with an office or a break room or a lab or something like that. And while the person who's actually performing the instrument processing may be taking all of the necessary precautions, it's likely that other users of the space who are not performing instrument processing are not appropriately garbed in protective equipment. So once we've gotten through cleaning, we're sufficiently clean and dry, instruments need to be separated, and then they get placed into either pouches or cassettes. And when you're packing instruments for sterilization, the instrument instructions for use are what should be considered to determine the sterilization parameters. And then if you find instruments that require the same parameters, then they can be sterilized together in the same load. Additionally, chemical indicators should be included with every pouch or cassette to ensure that proper sterilization is occurring. Oftentimes, you'll find pouches that actually have a chemical indicator built right into it. Sometimes there will be even one on the outside and on the inside of the pouch, and then you can look at those for your chemical indicator. And then cassettes, those would be wrapped with CSR or a similar wrap, and then you'll need to complete documentation to help identify the load. So once you're documented and wrapped, you'll be ready for sterilization. And like I mentioned previously, the parameters selected should be based on the instrument instructions for use. And then like items can be processed together. A couple notes regarding sterilization. There are many different types of sterilization. And while the processes may be different, the end result, sterile instruments, is the same. Steam is the most widely used method of sterilization. Even within the category of steam, though, there are other variations, such as pre-vacuum and steam flush pressure pulse. Both of these are types of steam sterilization that are categorized as dynamic air removal by the CDC, and they are both held to the same standard of quality. But since we've already cleaned instruments in step one, right, we've gotten large debris off, and really even the smaller debris, hopefully with the help of an ultrasonic cleaner, instruments should visually look clean by the time you're in step two. So how do we ensure that the sterilization process is actually working, right? If we can't perform an eye test, that's not the test that we should be performing. What do we do? This is where monitoring comes into play, which is step 4 of the process. And there are 3 different types of monitoring. There's mechanical, chemical, and biological. Mechanical monitoring is done through the sterilization device itself. So this should include tracking of the temperature and pressure that was reached to ensure that the parameters were met, right? I mentioned setting the parameters based off of the instrument instructions for use for these particular instruments. So then we're going to follow that through the next step of the process, and we're going to make sure that what we set on the sterilizer actually was what happened. Chemical monitoring is done through the chemical indicators that I mentioned that are either in the pouch or a part of the pouch or in the cassette. And then those will usually change color once the mechanical parameters are met. So this is kind of like your double check. Maybe the device had a malfunction and the screen reading says one thing and, it didn't actually reach that temperature or that pressure. This is kind of an extra layer of assurance that yes, we did meet the temperature because those chemical indicators have changed color or they've reached a certain level of progress across the chemical indicator. And then the third type of monitoring is biological monitoring. And that typically involves a specialized biological indicator that contains spores. So after the cycle is run, the biological indicator is tested separately, and that ensures that all spores have been eliminated. Anything that you would run in a load with a biological indicator should, by best practices, be quarantined until you're able to get the results back from that biological indicator. And CDC best practice recommendations are that you test with a biological indicator at least once a week. Some facilities do it every day. Probably don't need to do it every load, but definitely at least once a week you should be testing and quarantining those instruments until you've gotten the results back. That way you can ensure that not only are your parameters being met, but the sterilizer is successfully eliminating those spores. And then the final step to a good instrument processing space is the storage. And this section can actually often be overlooked, but it's imperative to maintaining sterility of process instruments. So storage needs to be in a closed or covered cabinet away from any potential contaminants or water. This means it should not be under a sink, but also it means that we shouldn't put a sterilizer directly under the storage. That's something that I've seen before where the sterilizer was on the countertop and then that steam being released from the sterilizer can travel directly upward, potentially recontaminating instruments. Oftentimes during the sterilization process, you will get that residual water. So any pouches or packs that do become wet after sterilization, either they aren't fully dry when they come out of the sterilizer or they become wet again prior to their use. They should be considered contaminated and they should actually be returned to the beginning of the workflow for reprocessing. So with an instrument processing space supporting both clean and dirty areas, along with multiple wet and dry locations, I think it stands to reason that the cabinetry being utilized is vital to supporting the space. It should be specifically designed for a clinical environment with a modular or configurable design that can adapt to changing practice needs. I know we showed a linear workflow in the previous slides of dirty to clean. I like that particular workflow because it gives you a good visual of the whole process on one image. But those same principles, those same concepts, those same designs can be applied across a variety of workflows. You could have a galley style, you could have a U shape or an L shape. The best practices will dictate, how much space you need. We talked about the physical barrier between dirty and clean. If you don't have a physical barrier, you're going to need either a physical separation or countertop space equivalent of 4 feet. So there are ways to manipulate, again, that workflow that I just showed. So having a modular design to your cabinetry can be really beneficial so that you can take advantage of what maybe works best in your space. And then ergonomic principles should also be considered in the design of the cabinetry so that it can support the average height healthcare worker. They should be seamless designs, antimicrobial handles, solid surfaces, all things that can help protect against pathogens. And again, just like we don't want to necessarily share this space with other groups, we want this space to be as aseptic as possible, right? So the more that we can design to promote infection prevention, the better. And then lastly, the cabinetry should be durable to withstand the repeated use of medical grade cleaners without breaking down. So even if we use antimicrobial handles, even if we follow all the best practices, even if we have a great workflow, we're still going to be cleaning this space and probably fairly rigorously. So you want to make sure that whatever you choose, whatever materials are being utilized for your cabinetry are going to stand up to that repeated rigorous cleaning. And actually, Midmark's synthesis cabinetry meets all of those aforementioned design needs. It's designed with durability, steel-on-steel construction specifically crafted for use in a medical environment. It is modular in nature, which allows it to seamlessly integrate into existing workflows or easily adapt to changing needs. Each piece of the instrument processing workflow, the 5 steps that I mentioned, was taken into consideration when designing this, and there are dedicated spaces for each of the 5 steps in a proper dirty to clean workflow. And I think you can see that here. Like I mentioned, there's that custom physical barrier. There's obviously support for a couple of sterilizers with pull-out shelves. There's a separated storage space. I even mentioned previously just coloring the glass to kind of give you that extra visual indicator of dirty to clean. And each step of the way, it's designed to support that average height healthcare worker. One example of that support is the unique flow shelving design. So if you can tell on the image there on the right, all of those shelves are angled. It's about 15 degrees that they're angled. And that makes supplies both easier to see and to reach. And then if a bin is empty, it can be pulled out and the bin behind it will just gently glide into place. Empty bins can then be taken to a restocking area and placed in the back of the queue. And then if you think about like an instrument processing space, you might not want to bring in resupplies, right? You might not want to bring in a lot of consumables to fill these spaces back up. It might be easier to take the bins to a centralized location where you can refill the consumables and then bring the bins back. And this can help eliminate some vulnerabilities of bringing supply carts and things like that into and out of a sterile area. So whether you're considering that central sterile that I mentioned earlier, or if you're considering in-house, or maybe you already do one or the other, it's important to design the space specifically for the needs of your facility. Because again, even if you're doing central sterile, you're going to need a place to store those instruments aseptically when they come back to you. You're still going to need some level of instrument processing space. And Midmark actually has clinical design experts that'll walk through your specific space with you and can create a digital representation of your workflow. They can help provide that all-important holistic view of your environment, and it kind of allows you to lean on their expertise as designers. They've been trained in proper processing protocols, and they have access to a planning and design library to help them leverage past design experiences. So there's no charge to this service. It's just something that Midmark provides. It's great to take advantage of when you're considering redesigning a space. Aside from helping design and populate the space, Midmark also offers product-specific training for you and your teams. Our clinical education group offers specialized and tailored training both virtually and in person. And these are just a few images from some of the trainings that we've done out in the field. There are also on-demand training modules, and they're backed by EDAC certified designers and planners. But we've had a lot of really positive reaction to the on-site training. Virtuals are great too, but on-site and being able to actually walk through your space and talk you through the best practices and guidelines and how you can best follow them in your own space seems to be really helpful for people. Similar to the live design, being able to upload and walk through your own space digitally, this is a great follow-up to that maybe after getting past that point and needing some training. This is really helpful for that. So from designing and planning to implementation and training for both products and processes, Midmark is with you every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We greatly appreciate you sharing that insightful presentation with us today. So we've already have several questions come in, so let's dive in right into the Q&A. If you would like to submit a question, simply type it into the Ask a Question box and click Send. Okay, Ben, the first question I have is when thinking about designing for an instrument processing space, what do you think is the most critical thing to consider?
That's a good question. The first place to start would be probably the location of the instrument processing space. I know I mentioned it in the presentation, but if possible, it should be centrally located for that easy access. But also another different early question that we should be asking is the space dedicated exclusively to instrument processing? Something else I mentioned as I was going through it. We want to try and avoid combining the instrument processing space with other areas. And once that physical location is established, then you can have those more specific conversations about flow and furnishings and all of those types of things. But focusing on instrument processing best practices early in the design process is really vital, and keeping that mindset all the way through so that decisions are made to support that proper processing.
Okay, the next question I have is what if I am redesigning a current space that does not have enough square footage to accommodate the workflow you shared?
Yep, that's a very common question that we get. Either not enough space or just maybe it doesn't align with, again, that straight line. Because I believe that run specifically is around 17 feet. And there are a lot of places where it's like, there's no way I could get 17 feet, certainly in a straight line dedicated for this. So that's when we start looking at those other designs, the galley or the L shape, things like that. But the most important part is that dirty to clean workflow and preventing cross contamination. And that's true whether you're processing in-house or not. And then from there, the various best practices, there are guidelines. Like I mentioned, there's single room guidelines, there's multi-room guidelines. Those best practices are going to dictate how to best lay out the rest of the space, regardless of the size. There are variations in design that you can use to maximize the space, and the live design team at Midmark is well versed in planning those spaces, so they can definitely help you make the most out of what's available to you.
Okay, and the next question is what happens when best practices, guidelines, or regulations change and an instrument processing space becomes outdated?
Yep. It can happen. It can definitely happen. It's important to stay on top of best practices, both for compliance purposes, but also for staff and patient safety. Best case scenario, if that does happen, if you've designed a space and then something changes, would be to reconfigure the space to meet the new requirements. And this can be costly or it can be challenging with traditional cabinetry. But I mentioned the Midmark cabinetry is modular, so it can be reconfigured really easily. The wall-hung cabinets actually each use a single bracket, and the layout could be added to over time. And then we already have numerous options that satisfy the common best practices set forth by CDC, AAMI, FGI, all of those groups. So.
Okay, well, it looks like we've run out of time. For those questions we didn't have time to answer, we'll be getting back to you via email. That concludes today's webcast. On behalf of Healthcare Purchasing News, I'd like to thank Ben for sharing that great presentation with us, Midmark for sponsoring today's event, and of course, all of you for joining. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.